Hey, now Jason, you ready for the Hall of Fame award recipients? Okay. That's why he's a writer.
Thank you.
I just think.
All right, Bob sits down and I'm sorry. And finally, we present the 2019 Joe Sinnott Hall of Fame Award for an inking career in American comic books of outstanding accomplishment. Lifetime achievement means 25 years minimum, 2 winners chosen annually. This honor is also chosen by the Internal Nomination Committee. The ever-expanding list of our formidable former Hall of Fame recipients can be found at InkwellAwards.com. Former Hall of Fame award recipients include Joe Sinnott, Terry Austin, Dick Giordano, Klaus Janson, Al Williamson, Wally Wood, Kevin Nolan, Mark McKenna, Scott Williams, Dick Ayers, Murphy Anderson, Joe Simon, Tom Palmer, Joe Kubert, Steve Ditko, Joseph Rubenstein, Frank Giacoya, Jerry Ordway, Rudy Nebrez, Joe Giella, and Bob McLeod. The nominees for this year's prestigious honor were Neal Adams, Dan Adkins, John Betty, Brett Breeding, Carl Kessel, Bob Layton, Pablo Marcos, Alan Milgrom, Bob Wiacek, and Bernie Wrightson. To present the first of our 2 winners is a longtime artist, writer, and former editor. I'm supposed to be waiting for, is he around?
Larry.
Where's Larry? Where's Larry? Hey, Larry. Larry Hama. Hama. Sorry. Hama. I'm a Canadian A coming out. Yes. So he would be coming up to present Neal, but I don't see him, so I will take. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Larry Hama. Things were going too smoothly, so we had to interrupt with something.
Isn't it?
Okay.
Thank you for being here. It's all yours.
Neal Adams and inking. What can I say? The most important thing is that, like, when you think about Neal's work, and his inking especially, I mean, that's what gives it the quality that it makes it immediately recognizable as Neal Adams, is his fist and his technique and what he puts behind it. And the fact that a huge percentage of the lines are driven by conscious thought. When you look at a lot of inking, a good percentage of it is done on overdrive. Guys sit there and, okay. they know what they're delineating, you know, and you know, for a lot of what they're doing, they're just moving their hand. It's practiced and it's skill, but it's on overdrive. And when Neal inks, you get the sense that there's a big percentage of the millimeters of line are actually driven by conscious thought. That's a big difference. You know, and it makes it all very recognizable. When I first started working at Continuity in the early 70s, sometimes there would be 5 of us in the front room penciling storyboards and comps and motion boards as fast as our little fingers could do it. And there would be like me and Ralph Reese and Russ Heath and Carl Potts and whoever else penciling these things as fast as we could, and Neal would finish. And he'd go off to the coffee room and come back with a cup of coffee and a Linzer tart, and we'd be like, furiously trying to catch up, and he'd have already gone through the stack, and he'd say, "You guys are wusses if you can't keep up with an old fart like me." And even then, as fast as it was, and he was inking with Pentel, and the fact that he had 5 different guys with lots of different styles sitting there penciling it, once Neal inked it, it looked like Neal Adams. And there's not a super lot of inkers that you could say that about, that really can overpower everything. And the fact that he was able to convey this and to teach it to everybody that came up through the studio, through a real old-fashioned atelier art studio methodology. He started the Crusty Bunkers, which was pretty important to inking at that time. Crusty Bunkers was put together because lots of times jobs would be so late. And you'd have to get a whole crew together to finish it. And Neal would put together the crew, and he would supervise it, and he would do the heads, and everybody else would do everything else. But he would go over everything and smooth it all out. And once that magic had happened, it all would hold together. And we could ink like an entire Doctor Strange story over the weekend, or do an entire John Buscema Savage Sword of Conan story over the weekend, which is pretty impossible. What he has done for inking on so many different levels is difficult to convey. I know that the only reason that I'm in the comic book business is because Neal had his foot in the door at DC when the attitude in the early 70s was like, well, we got everybody we need. I mean, we got Gil Cade, and we got all these guys that could do, 68 pages a week. What do we need with some, young Turk that can only do like a page a day? And Neal stuck his foot in the door, and he got in guys like Bernie Wrightson, Mike Kaluta, Jeff Jones, that wouldn't have been able to get in the door otherwise. And I got my first job penciling an 8-page horror story at DC because Neal said to the editor, look, if you give this kid an 8-page story to draw, I'll ink it. And that's how I got my foot in the door. And I've seen Neal do that countless times. So it's, his contributions to the entire concept of inking in comics is sort of hard to fathom, because a lot of what he did is under the surface, and his influence runs through all of it like that. I don't know what else I can say. But, you know, he's one of the most terrific inkers ever. I was very lucky as a young penciler that the first 4 people that ever inked my stuff were Ralph Reese, Wally Wood, Neal Adams, and Dick Giordano. So it's been downhill ever since. And, you know, that I know for a fact that every penciler I know that's ever been inked by Neal, you know, appreciates it to the core. And if they were smart, they took it home and they studied every inch of it. Because what somebody that knows what they're doing does to your pencils as a penciler, just one page of that is like a master's degree, you know, and you can't get that anywhere else. And I owe everything to this guy. What can I say? I love him.
Neal, you can come on up with our Ms. Inkwell escorts. Neal is a first-time nominee for the Sinnott Hall of Fame Award and first-time winner.
Thank you. Put this in my pocket. It's magnetic. It's got a magnet.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to put it there.
All right.
Don't drop it.
Don't try. Try not to drop it. I could thank you guys, or I could tell you stories. What do you like?
Stories.
No thank. It's not this thank shit. No, stories. Exactly. Okay. 3 stories. Stan Drake, Russ Heath, and Fred Eng. Are there any inkers here? Wannabe inkers? Inkers? Okay. Let me tell you the tool you'll never use. A Gillette 290 pen point. Have you heard of a Gillette 290 pen point? No? Yes? It's like a feather. Exactly. You know who uses it or used it when he was alive? Stan Drake. Oh, yes. Because Stan Drake used it. Because I didn't want anybody to be able to do what I couldn't do. Elmer Wexler never used a 290. Used a brush. Used a brush. Anyway, Stan Drake used a 290. Let me tell you something about pens and brushes. Philosophy. A brush, you can't feel it touch the paper. A pen, you can feel it touch the paper. So a pen is done by touch and eye, and a brush is done by eye, never by touch. Okay? That's the difference between the two. A Gillette 290, you can't tell when it hits the paper. It's made of steel, and it goes like this, boo, like that. As soon as you touch the paper, it goes boo, like that. And it lets the ink down. And if you don't make that line fast enough, it'll turn into a puddle. Stan Drake could take that line and use it for anything. Touch the paper, psh, finish the line. Never made a puddle. Very hard, very hard. Very few people can learn to use their tools that way. Stan Drake did, and I learned it because he did it, and because I hate somebody knowing something I don't know. So I learned it, okay? But there are lessons that are very hard to learn and almost impossible to learn, which is the second subject. Russ Heath, who had a mind like Michael Golden. There's only 2 people that I know in the world. There's only 2 people in the world that had minds like this. I'm going to kill you. 2 people in the world that had minds like this. Are you finished? Jesus. Two people, Russ Heath and Michael Golden. They could project, and Golden still can, project what's in his mind to the paper and then trace it. If Russ Heath did a drawing, or Michael Golden did a drawing in pencil, and then he inked it, the pencil drawing would disappear under the line that he inked, and you couldn't find it. Russ Heath, when he was 10 years old, could draw a man, a cavalry officer, astride a horse, starting at the lower left-hand hoof of the horse, and then working up and finishing the guy and coming back down and finishing the whole thing at 10 years old. At 10 years, whatever he saw in his mind, he could do. Fantastic, but his inking style, made you look at him differently, because if you looked at Golden and you look at Russ Heath, you realize these guys are thinking alike, and Michael Golden learned it from Russ, because Russ is a genius. I don't know what kind of a genius, a crazy genius, but a genius. I have to say crazy genius because he was crazy. He could draw a tiger tank in perspective according to the lens that he had in his mind of how far that tiger tank was from the lens on a double-page spread, which he did in my studio, double-page spread, tiger tank coming at you with every piece of canvas and weaponry on it without reference, because he memorized it. And it would be perfect in perspective. Then he would shadow one side of it with cross-hatching. And the cross-hatching was so perfect that the same measurement was between each line. Michael Golden can do that. I don't know how. I can't. I am an artisan. They are artists. I don't understand. And I would turn to Russ and I would say, Russ, how do you do that? How do you do that cross-hatching? The angle is the same. He could go across 6 inches and the angle would be the same. I put a triangle on it, it would be the same. I said, do you like to do that? And he turned to me, looked at me as if I was crazy, and said, if somebody paid me to cross-hatch a wall, I would do it. Is that crazy? Okay. So there are geniuses in the business. People mysteriously sliding between the cracks that you don't know and you don't understand, but if you study both of these guys, you'll learn some things that fast. Michael Golden looked at Russ Heath's job that he did on Miracle Man and Mr. Miracle, and he absorbed everything that Russ did on that job and applied it immediately to his own work. Just looked at it and applied it, and his work changed overnight. Because he's a genius, but weird, like Russ. And you run into these people. Now I'm going to tell you, third story, that was the second story. First was the 290 pen point. This is the second, now the third. Fred Eng, never heard of him. He's an animation inker. When I was 15, I went to the School of Industrial Arts. It was called, at the time, it was called the School of Art and Design. Now my granddaughter is going there. It's a great school. It's a high school, vocational high school. At night, we were given the opportunity to go to an animation studio and learn how to ink animation cells, old style, on acetate, over pencil drawings on paper. You put the acetate, and then you ink on the animation cells for Bert and Harry Peel, the Peels brothers, for Peel's Beer. Big, thick animation lines. And we were going to be trained, those of us who were lucky to be part of this, we're going to learn to become animation inkers, by Fred Eng, who had an accent. Now I have to tell you and apologize for this accent, because being 15 years old, we were all 15 years old, we made fun of it. And he had a kind of a funny accent. So I apologize, because as an adult, I'm not supposed to do this. But I'm going to do it. I'm going to do the accent, because it's part of the story. So you have to forgive me. He would say, you pick up your boss, and show me how you hold your boss. And we look at each other and we kind of smile. We'd kind of laugh at him because his accent was, boss? Really? Okay. Pick up a boss. You say, look on your finger. That is a writer's bump. You have a writer's bump on your finger? Do you? Huh? A little bump. Fine. Anybody who inks generally has that. I don't have it. Oh, pardon me. I don't have it. Fred Ang sent, feel my finger. Okay. 15 years old, I'll feel his finger. No writer's bump. Why? Because you Americans are gorillas. Huh? You Americans are gorillas. You hold your pen and your boss like a gorilla. Really? Oh. What do you mean? You hold your pen on the bone of your finger. Right there. How do you hold it? You hold your boss on the pads of 3 fingers. So you can do this. While you ink. You can't do this. You can't do this. Right? Can't rotate your hand. Can't rotate your fingers. He could rotate his hand. So therefore, he could take a brush and make a circle. And the hairs of the brush would follow his finger, follow the brush around, and make a circle. He could actually take a brush, which I don't have a brush on me, thin brush, and he could make a circle, and a half a circle, which was on the side of Harry Peel's hair. 1, 2, 3 loops in one stroke. Nobody in comics can do that. Nobody. Because we hold our bosses like gorillas. We do. It's true. We hold them against the bones of our fingers. So we have no movement. We don't know how to move our hand. So we looked at Fred Ang, and the dawning of reality came into our heads, and we said, this guy's a genius. This guy knows stuff that we don't know. So we wanted to learn from Fred. And he taught us many things. He taught us, I'll show you what he taught us. Brush, right? Tip of a brush. He said, you put your brush in the ink, you take your brush out of the ink, and you wipe your brush on the edge of the ink bottle, and then you wipe the tip and make a tip, and then you ink. Yeah? No? What? He says, why do you put your brush in the ink and then wipe it on the ink bottle and make the ink go back in the bottle? Because we're gorillas? Because you are gorillas. What are we supposed to do? Okay, he says, this is the tip. This is the inkwell. You put your brush in the ink, and you wipe the tip, and you leave the ink in the brush. Oh. And then you ink. Now you have a full brush of ink. Oh, God. Anyway, everything he taught us was right, and everything we did was wrong. And I'll show you what he did beside that. I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit. We worked on acetate, animation acetate. These were Bert and Harry Peel's eyes. Okay, that's the nose. This is the mouth down here. It's Bert and Harry. Bert was fat, Harry was thin. But they both had these eyes. He said, okay, I'm going to tell you the last story, but believe me, there are many more stories, he's going to say. So they're just going to tell you one. He said, ink the eyes. Okay, we take the brosse, we try to hold it right, and we make a circle. Then we fill it in with black, and then we make a circle, and we fill it in with black. He would say, no. Okay, what do we do? He says, you dip the brosse in the inkwell, you wipe the very little tip. You take the brosse and you put it there, in the middle, pull it away. And we watched him as the ink flowed down his brush and onto the acetate, and he pulled his brush away, and then the ink spread to the edge of the pencil drawing of that dot, and it stopped. Then he went to the other eye and he did the same thing, and the ink went to the edge of that pencil dot, and it stopped. That's how you make that circle. And I learned to do that because Fred Ang told me, and I knew I was a gorilla. If you learn to hold your brush right, you can do anything. You can make any kind of a stroke. You can make a stroke that's thick and thin. You can make a stroke that's just thin, that's just thick. You can make a stroke that starts thick and goes thin, make a stroke that starts thin and goes thick. I just described 6 strokes. Most inkers in American comic books ink one stroke, thick and thin and thick and thin. There's 5 or 6 different strokes you can use. You need to learn them. Artists need to learn them to be good inkers, to carry on traditions that have been known for thousands of years. The reason Fred Ang knew how to do this is because in the country he came from, he was inking lettering vertically on cloth and on paper since he was 2 years old. We don't have that tradition in America. So we need to find it. We need to reach out. We need to go to other countries, and we need to learn that. That's what I learned from Fred Ang. And maybe that's why I got the award today. I don't know. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, Neal Adams. Right on. All right. What are we going to follow that with? Next, I'd like to introduce Inkwell Awards Special Ambassador J. David Spurlock, who will speak on behalf of our posthumous Second Sinnott Hall of Fame Award recipient. David is an award-winning author, historian, educator, creator rights advocate, documentary filmmaker, and associate to star talents Frazetta, Basil Gogas, Neal Adams, Jim Steranko, Joe Kubert, Carmine Infantino, Julius Schwartz, Wallace Wood, and Dan Adkins. David, will you join us? There's the ladies.
Okay. I think we're supposed to have a slideshow. I asked for it to be done as a loop so we could just use it as eye candy while I talked instead of me talking about individual ends. Do you know if it's a loop? Great. Okie dokie. All right. I wrote a very long article, and I decided I'm going to turn it into a book. So keep your eyes peeled for a Dan Adkins book sometime, hopefully in the next year. I'm talking to P. Craig Russell about maybe doing the foreword to that. Anybody here know any hillbillies? Anybody remember the great renaissance of hillbilly TV? Can you name some hillbilly TV shows? That's a good one. I consider the Dukes of Hazzard the end of the great hillbilly. Andy Griffith. I'll put Andy Griffith in there. A good one is the Real McCoys. Also, there were some seasons was known as the McCoys, and some seasons were known as the Real McCoys. Do you know where that was set at? Where did they live? It may have been shot in Sacramento, but they were supposed to be in West Virginia. Okay, anybody here from West Virginia? There's nowhere more hillbilly than West Virginia. I get to say that because I was born in Memphis. That's close enough. Eastern Tennessee is much more hillbilly than Western Tennessee. Memphis is in Western Tennessee. So anyway, I'm here to talk about my friend Dan Adkins. Danny Lee Adkins was a hillbilly, and he was born in West Virginia. And he moved all over the place. He went into the military. He was born in 1937 in West Virginia, moved to Pennsylvania. When he went into the military, he's in Reno, Nevada, Phoenix, Arizona. And then when he got out, he came to New York, lived in Brooklyn. And then after working for Marvel and working for Tower and working for Wally Wood in New York, and his place getting broke into a couple times and him getting mugged a couple times, he moved to Ohio. And then after a while in Ohio, he moved back east to New Jersey, right across the river from Manhattan, where he could commute in. He became an art director at Marvel. He was fun, he was generous, he was a colorful character. Despite his many years in the New York area, never lost his colloquial country accent. Starting with working with Wallace Wood in the mid-60s, who Adkins had grown up admiring, reading EC comics in the 50s. He began work on Thunder Agents in 1965. Adkins' rise led him to collaborate with many premier talents, including John Buscema, Barry Windsor-Smith, Jack Kirby, Jim Steranko, Rich Buckler, Don Newton, Steve Ditko, Herb Trimpe, Gene Colan, Paul Gulacy, and Gil Kane. He is a versatile talent. Adkins wrote, one of the few artists to get credit for writing at Marvel. Penciled, most notably on Doctor Strange. Painted. We started our little slideshow with Adkins painting for Science Fiction Digest magazine. And most famously inked in the comic book industry for major publishers including Marvel Comics, Gold Key, Warren Publishing, DC, and Tower Comics from 1965 for over 5 decades until his passing at the age of 76 in 2013. Along with his associates Wallace Wood and Bill Pearson, Dan also pioneered as a fanzine publisher. Adkins served as art director at Marvel, as a consultant to friends Jim Steranko, and mentored a new generation of artists including Val Merrick, Paul Gulacy, and P. Craig Russell. All right. Now I'm going to do a little improvisation. Let's see. Well, if Neal can imitate someone, I'll try to imitate Adkins. I do other imitations. I do Gil Kane. Well, let's see. All I'll do on Adkins, I've never imitated Adkins publicly. I'll just say, "Ah, Dave." I had to work on that. I first met Dan about a quarter of a century ago. He didn't do many conventions, but he happened to do one of the earliest Wizard shows in Philadelphia, right about 25 years ago, and that's where we met. And then after that, I got to know him better. He moved, in his later years, he lived in Reading, PA, One reason he was drawn to Reading was because he was very close friends with Jim Steranko, and Jim lives in Reading. And so I went out to Reading, and Jim and I were going to go to dinner. He says, well, let's swing by and pick up Adkins. And we did. We went out to dinner. And we had a really good time. And at the end of the dinner, Jim reached for the check. And Adkins looked at me like, what the hell's going on? Because Jim never reaches for the check. And then I wrote a book on wood and did a long interview with Adkins. That was great. He had a wonderful memory. He could quote me all the page rates and everything. It was great. And he was very generous. He was into electronics. I remember him gifting me one time a headset. And I tried to be generous back. I would find out that he was buying my books. I'm like, Dan, don't buy my books. I'll send you the books. Oh, no, I want to. Your books are great. I want to support them. I'm like, Dan, I'll send you the books for free. And he kept buying them. One time he gifted me a big folder. Some of his favorite artists were Wally Wood, Al Williamson, John Buscema, and Frank Frazetta. Those four guys were really tops with him. And he gifted me a big folder of scrap that he had collected on mostly Williamson and Buscema. At some point, he got a bad reputation for swiping. And he actually learned to swipe from Wood. The difference was that when Wood inked it, like Larry was talking about with Adams, he could take anyone's roughs and in inking it, turn it into Adams. Everyone would just see the Adams. Well, Wood could do the same thing. Unfortunately, Adkins didn't quite, and people reckon also Adkins picked more recent things to swipe from, whereas Wood tended to pull, if he was going to pull a drawing, he'd pull it from a Golden Age piece, or he'd take it from a photo. Adkins was taking more recognizable things like Frazetta or Buscema to swipe from. And that was sad that he got a bad reputation for that. But he really knew the art. His style, as Neal was saying, that there's a traditional inking line for comic books. And it's here in the 21st century, it has changed quite significantly because we have people like Neal Adams and Bill Sienkiewicz and people who have expanded the medium quite considerably. And now we have computers and we can reproduce lines different from what they could reproduce in the 40s, 50s, 60s. But Dan had a very traditional inking line, the thin to thick to thin, fairly similar to Sinnott in that way. I wanted to say, I've actually been campaigning for Adkins to get this award for a few years. When I think of particularly Marvel inkers, today everyone really sees Sinnott as number one, and he deserves that. And I would say Giacoya would come after that. And I feel like Giacoya doesn't really get his due, probably because he died earlier. And I've seen over the years, people who live longer tend to get more credit. And I'm bully for them. But Adkins, I felt, was kind of like the third man in that roster. But actually, someone else should be in there, and I'm going to start my campaigning for him now, is Chick Stone. What Joe Sinnott is now seen as the ultimate classic Marvel inker, Chick Stone was before Joe Sinnott became the classic Marvel inker. When Wood left Marvel to go over and start Tower, talent followed him. Steve Ditko left Marvel and went over to Tower. Chick Stone left Marvel, went over to Tower. It was, I frequently refer to it as the image of the 60s. And people were coming. Gil Kane came over from D.C. And other people. But so after this, I'm very happy that Dan is getting this Hall of Fame award. He passed away, and now I'll start campaigning for Chick Stone. So I'm currently managing one of my many hats that I wear. I'm currently managing the Wallace Wood Estate. And somehow it came to my attention, I can't remember how, DC basically offered us a deal on like a really good wholesale deal on some Thunder Agents hardcovers. I'm like, oh, great, yeah, I'll invest in some Thunder Agents hardcovers. We could sell them at conventions and raise some money to keep the estate going. And so I called Dan up. Nobody is more important to that work, that body of work, other than Wood. Dan would be the next guy. Ralph, I would say Ralph Reese is probably the next biggest name to come out of. Really, when you look at the comics industry, there's two studios that so many people came through. And it was the Wood studio, and then it kind of shifted. And it's almost like the baton was passed to Neal at a certain point. You know, he's a little younger. And so everyone either came through the Wood studio or they came through the continuity studio, and a couple of people like Larry Hama actually came through both, and Ralph Reese too. But at that point, in the mid-'60s, Ralph was very young. And Adkins was the first guy that wasn't just really assisting Wood, wasn't just tracing things or looking for reference for him, but he was actually doing some penciling too. And then Wood would ink, kind of like Larry had mentioned with the Krusty Bunkers, how Neal would do whatever he wanted to do, particularly the heads and things like that, some key figures, and Wood would do the same. And then Adkins would ink some, but he would also do penciling in there too. So I wanted to ask Adkins if he would sign a bunch of these hardcover Thunder Agents books I got. And I called him up and we chatted for a while, and he said, yeah. And I said, I'll drive over to Reading and I'll take you out to dinner, and then we'll go hang out at your place, and sign a bunch of books. And he says, yeah, and we set up a date to do it. After a while, a couple of weeks down the road or something, after a while I called Steranko. I said, look, I'm going to be in town. I'm going to go see Dan and take him out to dinner. I'll swing by and pick you up. And he says, well, what day do you have in mind? We agreed on a date. So the day before the appointment, so I called Dan to reconfirm, let him know, remind him I'm coming over. It's a great piece here. This is Gil Kane inked by Dan Adkins. Gil Kane's Captain Marvel work, very important work for Gil at Marvel. There's a later piece, that may be it there. There's a later Gil Kane page inked by Adkins in the 80s, I would say that is, where he gets a little bit of a different line. He's doing more of a spontaneous line than that traditional line I was talking about. There's him inking Kirby. He should have inked a lot more Kirby. For some reason, he didn't, but he really should have. And he loved Kirby. He would have loved to ink more Kirby. And the little bit of Kirby he inked was just fabulous, including when Kirby came back to Marvel after he'd been at DC, which was, I'm just going to say it, just a hair past Jack's prime. And key inkers like Sinnott, Romita, and Adkins would take a little more time to make sure that Kirby came out the best. That's Adkins inking Steranko there. Back to my story. So I call Adkins to firm up our dinner date and signing date, and there's no answer. I call him a couple times, there's no answer. And so then I call Steranko. I said, look, I can't get a hold of Dan. And he says, well, he keeps crazy hours. He's probably still asleep, but just come on over. We'll go over there. If I have to beat on his door, we'll wake him up. I said, fine. So I go swing by and pick up Jim first. We go over Adkins' place. Jim goes, beats on the door. Adkins does not come to the door. And finally, Jim says, I don't know where he's at, but let's go on to dinner. So we go to dinner without Dan. And we have dinner, and then afterwards I say, well, I got these books. He's supposed to sign these books for me. I said, could I leave them with you, and the next time you see him, drop them off, and then I'll come back whenever he's finished. Yeah, leave them in the trunk of my car. So I start heading back to Jersey. I'm about halfway back, and the phone rings, and it's Steranko, and he just got a call from Dan's son, and Dan had just passed away. They found him a few days earlier, and that's it. I just had to share that with you. I miss him. I got one or two little last words here to read. Dan's career spanned 5 decades, comic book industry. Quote from Barry Smith. Dan was certainly my favorite inker in my original Conan period. Quote from Gil Kane. The best inkers I ever had were Dan Adkins, Wally Wood, and Kevin Nolan. John Buscema. I'm going to read the full-length version of this one. John Buscema. I rarely praise the inkers because I would have preferred to have inked everything myself. But my brother Sal, Joe Sinnott, Frank Giacoia, John Romita, Tom Palmer, Al Williamson, and Dan Adkins were all top professionals who did great jobs inking me. And Dan in particular was a fun guy to work with. Though Adkins' work helped entertain millions of people and he helped mentor a new generation, his rich legacy has been for too long under-celebrated. It is a very deserving tribute, and with great pleasure that he is honored as he is worthy a member of the Inkwell Hall of Fame. That's it.
That's great. Thank you for all the time and this. Appreciate you being here.
It's going to be very difficult for me to let go of this, but I'm going to see that this gets to Dan's son.
Right on. Thank you, sir. Joe Sinnott, this award's namesake and first winner, made the following statement about this year's inductees. I was thrilled to learn of the 2 newest members to be inducted into the Inkwell Awards Hall of Fame. Neal Adams has certainly made his mark in the comic industry. When I think of Neal, I am drawn to his work on Batman and Green Arrow. Also running Continuity Associates Studio in New York City that gave many new up-and-coming young artists their starting comics. Neal and I were fortunate enough to work together on 2 Thor series. Then decades later, we were asked to work together once more on a Batman blank cover to support the Inkwell Awards. That was certainly a lot of fun. Dan Adkins has also had a long, distinguished career in comics. Dan was a great penciler in his own right, but primarily as an inker. His work on the Doctor Strange comics is what I remember him best for. Dan, like me, was a very sought-after inker, having inked a number of artists, far too many to count. His ink line sure brought out the best in many pencilers. He is truly missed. It is with great pride and pleasure that we get to welcome these 2 fine artists and inkers into the Inkwell Awards family. Congratulations on your election into the Inkwell Awards Hall of Fame and the newest recipients of the Joe Sinnott Hall of Fame Award, class of 2019. Well done, gentlemen. Jolton Joe Sinnott. And thank you very much. To close us out, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bob Allman.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was excellent. Can we have another round of applause for all of our winners? Thanks again to all of our guest speakers. There will not be a Q&A. It's funny because Stal started supporting doing that in the beginning, and I'm glad we did because this is probably the fewest amount of recipients that have been able to appear. So I hope you understand and enjoyed that. And thank you so much for your support, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in 2020.